My dad started dating my mom's sister and ignores me. The day Dad kicked me out is seared into my memory. It was a cloudy, biting afternoon with that damp chill hanging in the air, the kind that seeps into your bones. I'd just come home from school, expecting the usual, an empty house, maybe a quick meal by myself at the kitchen counter. I was used to Dad being gone most nights, and to Aunt Meg lurking around, reorganizing every inch of the place. But that day, I felt something strange the moment I walked through the door. The house felt charged, tense, like the silence was waiting for me to notice something. When I looked up, Dad was standing in the hallway, his arms crossed, eyes fixed on me with this cold, weary look. Aunt Meg was beside him, a faint, self-satisfied smile on her lips. "Pack your things," he said, his voice rough and tired. I blinked, thinking maybe I'd heard him wrong, but he didn't say it again. Just stood there, with Aunt Meg's hand on his shoulder, her face like stone. I was used to Dad being distant, especially since Mom passed, but this was something else. For a second, I wanted to believe he was joking, but deep down I knew he meant it. So I went up to my room, my stomach churning, trying not to think about what any of this meant. Every step up the stairs felt heavier than the last, like my body knew I was moving toward the end of something. I threw my school bag on the bed and stared around my room. It had been mine since I was a kid. The posters on the wall, the old guitar in the corner that I barely knew how to play, even the books Mom had given me over the years, all lined up on my shelf. It all felt like it was vanishing before my eyes, slipping away before I even had a chance to hold on to it. I grabbed my duffel bag, barely able to think clearly as I stuffed in a few clothes, my toothbrush, the framed photo of Mom and me from my nightstand. I couldn't stop my hands from shaking as I packed, my mind spiraling. Why now? Why was he kicking me out? But then I realized, maybe deep down, I'd been waiting for this. When I finally made it back downstairs, Dad barely looked at me. Aunt Meg was right there beside him, holding his arm like she had every right to be there. I wanted to scream, to ask him how he could do this to me, how he could choose her over his own kid. But he just looked past me, his voice flat and emotionless. "You're too much like her," he muttered, as if the words were acid on his tongue. It was the closest thing to an explanation he would ever give. And then just like that, it was over. My dad, the man who used to take me on fishing trips, who read me bedtime stories when I was little, had decided he was done with me. I didn't even get a hug goodbye or a single word of comfort. I was just dismissed. Outside, I walked down the driveway with my bag slung over my shoulder, feeling the weight of everything crashing down around me. I could feel the tears burning behind my eyes, but I forced myself to keep it together. Uncle Charlie was waiting by his truck, his face twisted with worry as he watched me approach. He didn't ask what happened. He just opened his arms, and without a word, I fell into them, feeling the warmth of family I'd almost forgotten existed. When I climbed into Uncle Charlie's truck, the smell of old leather and coffee wrapped around me. It was such a familiar scent, one I'd always associated with visits to his place. And for a second, I felt safe. He didn't push me to talk, which I was grateful for. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel with a quiet intensity. The rain had started up, a steady drizzle tapping against the windshield as we pulled away from the only home I'd ever known. I stared out the window, watching the house fade into the distance, every detail burning itself into my mind. The porch light flickering, the faded red paint Dad had meant to touch up years ago, the empty bird feeder Mom used to refill every weekend. It hurt, deep down, knowing that Aunt Meg would be walking through that house now, filling it with her perfume and her belongings, erasing every trace of Mom like it was nothing. I could practically see her rearranging the furniture, tossing out old photos, carving out a space that was hers and hers alone. Uncle Charlie's voice broke through my thoughts, low and calm. "You're welcome to stay with us as long as you need, kid. Don't you worry about a thing." He kept his eyes forward, but I could see his jaw tighten, a telltale sign that he was angrier than he wanted to show. "Thanks, Uncle Charlie," I whispered, my voice barely coming out. I felt like I was shrinking, like every word was scraping out a part of me I hadn't been ready to lose. We drove for what felt like hours, though I knew it was only about a half-hour ride to his place. Uncle Charlie lived on the edge of town, in a quiet little neighborhood with houses spaced far enough apart that you could hear the crickets at night. When we pulled up to his house, the porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the front steps, and there was a faint sound of music coming from inside. I could see Sarah, Uncle Charlie's girlfriend, through the window, moving around the kitchen with her usual graceful efficiency. Uncle Charlie glanced at me as he cut the engine. "Sarah's been excited to have you," he said with a small smile. "She's already put fresh sheets on the guest bed and everything." I managed to nod, though my throat felt tight. Sarah was one of those rare people who made you feel at home instantly. She and Uncle Charlie had been together for a couple of years now, and while they weren't married, she'd been around enough that I thought of her almost like a second mom. When she opened the front door and spotted us, her face lit up with a gentle smile. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said softly, pulling me into a hug the second I stepped inside. Her warmth, the way she held me, reminded me so much of Mom, and for a second, I felt myself crumble. But I kept it together, swallowing down the lump in my throat as I hugged her back. "Hope you're hungry," she said, giving my shoulder a gentle squeeze as she led me inside. "I made lasagna, and I've got plenty left over. Figured you could use a good meal." I tried to thank her, but the words wouldn't come out, so I just nodded, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. Uncle Charlie and Sarah kept talking, guiding me toward the kitchen, setting out plates and glasses like it was just a normal dinner. They were giving me the space to breathe, to feel like I could settle into this strange, new reality without judgment or expectation. As we sat down to eat, I looked around their cozy kitchen. It was simple, filled with little touches that made it feel like home. Mismatched mugs hanging on a rack, a bowl of oranges on the counter, a stack of recipe books Mom used to lend Sarah every once in a while. It wasn't my home, not really, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was somewhere I belonged. That first night at Uncle Charlie's, I barely slept. I lay in the guest room, staring up at the ceiling, feeling lost in a way I couldn't even put into words. The room was cozy, with soft, faded blue walls and a small desk under the window. Sarah had left a quilt on the bed, probably handmade, and it smelled faintly of lavender. Everything about the room was welcoming, comfortable, but I felt like a stranger in it. My mind kept drifting back to Mom. She'd been gone over a year now, but some nights, it still felt like she was just a room away, reading or working on some craft project she'd later surprise me with. I remembered the nights she'd sit beside me on my bed when I was a kid, tucking me in, telling me stories with this soft glow in her eyes. She'd had a way of making me feel safe, no matter what. And now, here I was, in someone else's house, barely able to feel like myself. When morning finally came, I got up and stared at my reflection in the small mirror above the dresser. I looked off. My hair was a mess, eyes puffy like I'd just survived a storm. Part of me wanted to sink back under the covers and just disappear for a while. But the smell of coffee drifted down the hall, and my stomach reminded me I hadn't eaten much the night before. When I walked into the kitchen, Sarah was at the stove, humming softly as she flipped pancakes. Uncle Charlie was sitting at the table, already halfway through the newspaper, glancing up with a small smile as I entered. "Morning, kiddo," he said, folding the paper and setting it aside. "Hope you're hungry." Sarah's been on a pancake mission. Sarah turned and winked, holding up a spatula. "Blueberry pancakes, my specialty. Thought they might help you settle in." I managed to smile, pulling out a chair and sinking into it, feeling more tired than I wanted to admit. Uncle Charlie poured me a glass of orange juice, setting it in front of me before taking a sip of his coffee, watching me over the rim of his cup. "So," he began after a moment, "you want to talk about it?" The question was gentle, but I could feel the weight of it settling in my chest. I glanced down, tracing circles on the table with my finger. Part of me wanted to spill everything, to tell him how wrong everything felt, how Dad had practically erased Mom's memory, how Aunt Meg had taken over our lives. But the words tangled up inside me, too heavy to let out. Sarah, sensing my hesitation, brought over a plate stacked high with golden pancakes, setting them in the center of the table. "Take your time," she said softly, brushing a comforting hand over my shoulder. "We're just glad you're here." For a while, the three of us ate in silence, the quiet only broken by the soft clink of silverware and the occasional murmur between Uncle Charlie and Sarah. I took a bite, savoring the warm burst of blueberry and the slight crunch of sugar on the edges. It reminded me of Sunday breakfast with Mom, when she'd make pancakes from scratch, pouring each one in the shape of a heart, just to make me laugh. After a while, I found myself telling them bits and pieces, how Mom's things had slowly disappeared from the house, how Aunt Meg had taken over everything, even Mom's bedroom. The words came out in fragments, but Uncle Charlie and Sarah listened intently, never interrupting or rushing me. When I got to the part about Dad kicking me out, I saw Uncle Charlie's face harden, his jaw clenched tight. Sarah reached over and gave his hand a squeeze, her own expression sad but resolute. "He's got a lot to answer for," Uncle Charlie muttered, his voice low. "But you're safe here. Whatever you need, you've got it, all right?" I nodded, feeling the beginnings of relief creep in. Uncle Charlie might have his own battles with my dad. God knows they'd had their share of differences over the years. But I knew, without a doubt, he'd never let me down. After breakfast, Uncle Charlie suggested we go out and get some fresh air. He said it so casually, but I could tell he had an idea in mind. He tossed me an old jacket of his that was 2 sizes too big and grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. I pulled on the jacket, rolling the sleeves up, and followed him out to the truck. Sarah waved from the porch, her eyes warm, as if to remind me she'd be there when we got back. The drive was quiet, the only sound the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of gravel beneath the tires. Uncle Charlie wasn't much of a talker, especially when he knew something was weighing heavy on my mind. It was one of the things I loved most about him. He never pushed, just let the silence settle, trusting that when I was ready, I'd fill it. We drove out past town, the scenery shifting from rows of small houses to sprawling fields and open sky. It was a part of town I didn't visit much, full of winding roads and endless hills that seemed to stretch on forever. After about 15 minutes, Uncle Charlie turned down a dirt path that led to a clearing, a place tucked away and hidden from the world. I'd been there before, back when I was younger. Uncle Charlie had taken me fishing here once, showing me how to bait a hook and cast a line. It had been one of those perfect summer days, the air thick with the scent of pine and wildflowers, the sun casting golden light on everything. But today, the sky was overcast, casting the lake in shades of gray and blue, giving the place a quiet, almost somber feel. We climbed out of the truck, and Uncle Charlie gestured for me to follow him down to the lake's edge. I shoved my hands in my pockets, breathing in the cool, damp air, watching the ripples form on the water as a gentle breeze blew across the surface. Uncle Charlie picked up a flat stone from the ground, weighing it in his hand. "You remember how to skip stones?" he asked, glancing at me with a small smile. I nodded, managing a faint grin as I picked up my own stone. "Mom used to bring me here sometimes, too," I murmured, remembering the countless times she'd knelt beside me, guiding my hand, showing me the perfect flick of the wrist. He nodded, looking out over the water. She loved this place, said it was her way of escaping, even if just for a little while. I threw the stone, watching it hop across the lake 4 times before it finally sank. Uncle Charlie followed suit, his stone skipping a little farther, as if it could cross the whole lake if he willed it to. We stood there, side by side, tossing stones and letting the silence stretch between us. It felt peaceful, like being back in time for a moment, before everything had changed. Finally, Uncle Charlie broke the quiet. "I want you to know something, kid. You've been through more than most, and I'm not saying it's fair or that it makes sense. But you're tougher than you think." He paused, his gaze steady as he looked at me. "And no matter what happens, you've got people in your corner." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside me. There was a strength in Uncle Charlie's voice that I hadn't heard in a long time, and it felt like a reminder that even if Dad had turned his back on me, I wasn't alone. After a while, we both sat down on a fallen log near the lake, staring out at the quiet water. I told him a bit more about what had happened at home, about how Dad had practically abandoned me when Mom got sick, leaving me to figure things out on my own. Uncle Charlie listened, his face unreadable, but I could sense his frustration simmering beneath the surface. He didn't try to sugarcoat anything or make excuses for my dad. He just listened, letting me get it all out. When I was finished, Uncle Charlie let out a long, steady breath, almost as if he were carrying the weight of everything I'd just shared. You know, there was a time when your dad and I were close. Real close, he said quietly. But life, well, life changes people. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not. He looked at me then, his expression softening. But you're not him. You don't have to be, and you don't have to carry his choices on your back. He gave me a pat on the shoulder, solid and reassuring. You just be you, and you'll be all right. We sat there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the lake and the trees, the gentle rustle of leaves as the wind swept through. And for the first time since Mom had passed, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Later that afternoon, back at the house, I started unpacking in the guest room. I pulled out the few things I'd brought, clothes, some books, and the framed photo of Mom and me. I set the picture on the nightstand, the sight of her face filling me with a bittersweet warmth. Sarah knocked gently on the open door, a soft smile on her face as she stepped inside. Need any help getting settled? She asked, eyeing the small pile of my belongings on the bed. I shook my head. I didn't bring much, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah came closer, noticing the photo of Mom. She reached out, brushing a finger across the frame with a gentle expression. You look just like her, she murmured, her voice tender. Same kindness in your eyes. A lump rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down, nodding slightly. Thanks, Sarah, I whispered, the words barely escaping. She squeezed my shoulder, her warmth grounding me in a way that felt strangely comforting. You know, you're part of our family now, she said softly. So make yourself at home. This is your space, for as long as you need it. As she turned to leave, I found myself gripping the photo tighter, feeling the weight of her words settle over me. As I was unpacking in the guest room, the reality of my new life began to settle in. The room was small but cozy, painted a soft blue with framed landscapes hanging on the walls. It was nothing like my old room, with its posters and stacks of books, and the little souvenirs Mom and I had picked out together on trips. But this space was warm, and I felt, in a strange way, like it was already wrapping itself around me. I unpacked slowly, placing my clothes into the dresser drawers, then arranging my books on the small shelf beside the bed. Last, I took out the framed photo of Mom and me, one of the few things I grabbed in a hurry. It was from a family picnic years ago. Her arm was around me, our faces pressed close together, laughing about something silly. I placed the picture carefully on the nightstand, tracing the edge of the frame with my thumb. I barely heard Sarah approach, but there was a gentle knock on the door, and I turned to see her standing there, smiling softly. She'd been making herself scarce, giving me space to breathe, but now she took a few steps inside, glancing at the room, her hands tucked in the pockets of her apron. Need any help settling in? She asked, looking around at the few items I'd brought. Her voice was soft, warm, and I could tell she meant it. She really wanted to make me feel at home. I shrugged, trying to keep my face steady. I didn't bring much, I mumbled, hoping the smallness of my voice didn't give me away. Sarah moved closer, and her gaze fell on the photo of Mom. Her face softened, and she reached out, running her finger gently along the edge of the frame. You look so much like her, she murmured, almost to herself. That same kindness in your eyes. I couldn't say anything for a moment, my throat tight. I just nodded, feeling that mix of gratitude and ache I always felt when people compared me to Mom. I'd never minded before, but now the reminder that I was all that was left of her hit me harder than ever. Sarah met my eyes, and for a second, it felt like she could see right into everything I was carrying, all the heartbreak and confusion and loneliness. Without a word, she reached out, squeezing my shoulder, her touch warm and grounding. You know, she said softly, her voice steady and sure, your family here. Uncle Charlie and I, we're here for you, okay? For as long as you need us. I nodded, barely managing a quiet. Thank you. She gave me one last squeeze before letting go, lingering for a moment like she wanted to say more. Then, with a reassuring smile, she headed toward the door. Just before she left, she looked back. Make yourself at home, sweetheart. This is your space now." As she disappeared down the hall, I sank onto the bed, glancing at Mom's photo. The weight of what Sarah had said settled over me, wrapping me in a warmth I hadn't felt in so long. It was the first time in ages I'd heard someone call me family. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and something warm and sugary drifting down the hall. For a moment, I felt like I was back home, expecting to hear Mom humming in the kitchen as she poured my cereal. But then reality settled in, and I remembered where I was. The ache in my chest started up again, and I pushed myself out of bed, rubbing my eyes as I tried to shake off the feeling. When I made my way to the kitchen, Uncle Charlie was at the table, sipping coffee and reading the paper, while Sarah moved between the stove and the counter, flipping pancakes on the griddle. She turned and caught sight of me, her face lighting up with a welcoming smile. "Morning, kiddo," she said cheerfully. "I hope you're in the mood for pancakes. We're doing it up big today, blueberry, chocolate chip, the works." I managed to smile as I pulled out a chair and sat across from Uncle Charlie. He glanced over his paper and gave me a nod, one of those quiet, reassuring gestures he was so good at. "Sleep okay?" he asked, his voice low but warm. "Yeah," I lied, grabbing a glass of orange juice from the pitcher Sarah had set on the table. Truthfully, I tossed and turned all night, my mind racing, but I wasn't about to burden them with that. Uncle Charlie didn't press further, just gave me a small nod and went back to his paper, the corners of his mouth quirking up slightly, as if to say he understood. Sarah slid a plate of pancakes in front of me, topped with a dollop of whipped cream and a handful of blueberries. "Dig in," she said, looking pleased as I picked up my fork and took a bite. The pancakes were fluffy and sweet, with a faint hint of vanilla, just like the ones Mom used to make on weekends when we'd sit in our pajamas until noon. As we ate, the conversation drifted from the weather to a few harmless neighborhood stories. They didn't bring up my dad, and I was grateful for it. Uncle Charlie told me a little story about the last time he'd tried to make pancakes by himself. He'd accidentally used salt instead of sugar, and Sarah still teased him about it whenever he stepped near the kitchen. I couldn't help but laugh at his sheepish expression, feeling the smallest bit lighter as the warmth of the kitchen and the easy rhythm of their banter wrapped around me. At one point, Sarah glanced over with a gentle look, her voice soft. "I was thinking," she began carefully, "maybe this weekend we could take a little drive out to the farmer's market. It's just down the road, and they've got some great stuff this time of year. Fresh apples, honey pies. We could all go together, maybe pick up some things to make dinner." I looked at her, surprised she'd thought of including me like that. I hadn't gone to a farmer's market in years. Mom used to love them, wandering from stall to stall, filling our bags with everything from jams to homemade soaps. The idea filled me with a familiar nostalgia, bittersweet but comforting. "That sounds nice," I said quietly, nodding. "I'd like that." Uncle Charlie gave me a soft smile, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. "Then it's a plan," he said. "Saturday morning, we'll hit the market, stock up, and make a feast out of it." The thought of it, an outing, doing something together, gave me something to hold on to, something normal and grounding. I didn't say much after that, but I could feel a small spark of excitement starting to grow, like a flicker of light in all the darkness I'd been carrying. Saturday arrived with a clear, crisp morning, the kind that felt like the beginning of something new. The sun was just rising as Uncle Charlie, Sarah, and I piled into his truck, laughing as we squeezed in together with a few shopping bags and a thermos of Sarah's homemade coffee. Uncle Charlie let me sit up front, calling it the VIP seat, which made me smile despite myself. The drive to the farmer's market was only about 20 minutes, but it felt longer in the best way. Sarah played a few of her favorite songs on the radio, tunes from the 70s and 80s, singing along and nudging Uncle Charlie until he joined in. I didn't know the words, but it didn't matter. Their voices, full of joy and familiarity, filled the truck with this easy warmth that I hadn't felt in so long. When we pulled into the gravel lot by the market, the air was filled with the smell of apples and cinnamon, mixed with the earthy scent of hay bales stacked nearby. Stalls lined the open space, packed with everything from fresh produce to handmade candles and woven baskets. I looked around, taking it all in, feeling a mix of excitement and a pang of nostalgia. Sarah grabbed one of the bags, looping it over her shoulder as she nodded toward a stall with baskets of bright red apples. "All right, team," she said, grinning. "First stop, the apple stand. We're getting enough for pies, applesauce, and maybe even cider." We walked over, and I watched as she chatted with the vendor, picking out the best apples and holding them up for Uncle Charlie and me to inspect. The vendor, a friendly older man with a wide-brimmed hat, offered us slices to taste, and I couldn't help but smile as the sweetness filled my mouth. It reminded me of all the times Mom and I would split an apple on a hike, laughing as we tried to guess which orchard it had come from. Next, we wandered over to a booth selling fresh honey. Uncle Charlie bought a jar, saying he needed it for his tea, though I caught him sneaking a fingerful to taste before he closed the lid. He handed me the jar with a wink. "Best stuff around," he said, nodding. "We'll be putting this on everything for the next month." I couldn't help but laugh, feeling lighter as we made our way through the market. We stopped at nearly every stall, picking up squash, carrots, freshly baked bread, and a jar of homemade peach jam that Sarah insisted was too good to pass up. Every time I looked at them, Uncle Charlie and Sarah had this way of making everything feel so simple, so easy, like family could be just that, caring for each other without question or condition. When we reached a stall selling baked goods, Sarah got excited and pulled out a small box of cinnamon rolls, handing one to each of us. "Breakfast round 2, she declared, taking a big bite. As I took a bite of the warm, sticky pastry, something shifted in me, a kind of calm settling over all the chaotic, tangled emotions I'd been carrying. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about Dad or Aunt Meg or the hollow, aching loss of Mom. I was here with people who saw me, who wanted me around, who made me feel like I had a place to belong. Uncle Charlie caught my eye and gave me a small, encouraging nod, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. And maybe he did. By the time we loaded up the truck with bags of food, I felt a strange, unexpected sense of peace, like maybe this was a life I could learn to live in. Back at Uncle Charlie's house, we unloaded all the bags from the truck, laughing as Sarah tried to juggle a basket of apples, the honey, and a loaf of bread without dropping anything. Inside, she set everything on the kitchen counter and started sorting through our haul with an enthusiasm that made me smile. "So," she said, clapping her hands together, "who's ready for a baking marathon?" Uncle Charlie groaned dramatically, leaning back against the counter. "Just so you know," he said, winking at me, "she's serious. When Sarah says marathon, she means hours." Sarah rolled her eyes, already grabbing flour and measuring cups from the cupboard. "Oh, hush. You love my apple pie, don't you?" He sighed, a mock resignation in his voice. "All right, you got me there, but I'm on peeling duty only." I couldn't help but laugh at the way they bantered back and forth, each teasing the other with a kind of playful ease. It felt natural, the way they moved around each other in the kitchen, like a dance they'd practiced 100 times. They'd been together for years, but watching them now, it was clear how much they still enjoyed each other's company. Sarah handed me a small paring knife and a few apples. "You're with me on slicing duty," she said, her eyes warm. "And don't worry, I've got a secret family pie recipe that I'll share if you're up for it." I nodded, feeling oddly honored. Mom used to make apple pie, too. Her recipe was one of those handwritten, slightly smudged notes that she kept folded in an old recipe book. She'd always said she'd teach me when I was older, but we'd never gotten around to it. Somehow, standing here with Sarah, I felt like I was picking up something Mom had left behind for me. Uncle Charlie grabbed the apples he was peeling and started telling a story about a particularly disastrous pie attempt from years ago, when he'd accidentally left a bag of sugar open and ended up with ants in the pantry. Sarah groaned, shaking her head with a laugh. It was a week of ant traps and vinegar sprays. I thought I'd never get rid of them. As we worked, the kitchen began to fill with the comforting scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and apples, the warm smell wrapping around me like a blanket. I lost myself in the rhythm of slicing, peeling, and mixing, Sarah guiding me through each step of the recipe, her instructions patient and clear. She sprinkled flour over my hands to show me how to knead the dough, laughing as we ended up with a little flour dusting our noses and clothes. At one point, I caught myself laughing, a genuine, full-hearted laugh that surprised me. Uncle Charlie glanced over, his eyes crinkling with a smile, and I realized he'd been watching me, like he was waiting for this exact moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about the weight of the past or the uncertainty of the future. I was just here, laughing over apple slices and cinnamon. When we finally slid the pies into the oven, I leaned back against the counter, wiping my hands on a towel. Sarah closed the oven door with a satisfied sigh, grinning at the sight of our handiwork. "You did great," she said, nudging me gently. "Mom would have been proud of those pies." Her words hit me unexpectedly, the mention of Mom filling me with a strange mix of sadness and peace. I looked at Sarah, who was watching me with that gentle, understanding expression she seemed to wear so naturally. "Thanks, Sarah," I said quietly, and I meant it. She hadn't just shared her recipe today. She'd shared a piece of herself, inviting me into her world, making me feel like I belonged. Uncle Charlie set out plates and forks, and when the pies were finally done, we dug in while they were still warm, the taste rich and sweet. And as we sat around the table, savoring every bite, I felt the beginnings of something new taking root, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I was finding my way back to family. That evening, after we'd all had our fill of pie and the kitchen was cleaned up, I found myself lingering by the back porch. Uncle Charlie's house sat on the edge of a small wooded area, and in the fading light, the trees cast long shadows across the yard. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of fallen leaves and the faint smoky aroma of a nearby fire pit. I stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me as I took in the quiet. The sky was a deepening blue, scattered with the first few stars peeking out, and everything felt still, almost like the world was holding its breath. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling a calm settle over me that I hadn't known I was missing. The porch creaked softly, and I turned to see Uncle Charlie stepping out, his hands in his pockets, eyes reflecting the dim light. He nodded, a small, reassuring gesture as he leaned against the railing beside me. We stood there in silence, both of us gazing out into the woods, listening to the sounds of the evening, the faint rustle of branches, the call of a distant owl, the occasional crackle of dry leaves underfoot. After a while, Uncle Charlie broke the silence, his voice low and thoughtful. "You know, I used to come out here when things got heavy," he said, his gaze fixed on a spot in the trees. "There's something about being out here. No noise, just you and the quiet, that helps you sort through things." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Sometimes the world felt too loud, too overwhelming, and being surrounded by nature, by something steady and unchanging, had a way of calming the storm inside. "Mom used to take me to places like this," I murmured, almost to myself. "We'd go hiking or have picnics out in the woods, just to be away from everything." He nodded, his expression softening. She loved being outdoors. Said it reminded her to keep things simple, to focus on what mattered. He hesitated, glancing at me. "She'd be proud of you, you know?" The words hit me hard, the ache of missing her welling up inside me all over again. I swallowed, looking down at the worn boards of the porch as I tried to keep my voice steady. "Sometimes I don't feel like I'm doing enough. Like I'm letting her down." Uncle Charlie shook his head, turning to face me more directly. "Hey, you've been through a lot, more than most people your age should ever have to deal with. But you've kept going. You're here, and that's enough. That's more than enough." I glanced over at him, surprised by the firmness in his voice, the way he looked at me with absolute certainty. He wasn't just saying it to make me feel better. He meant it, every word. And somehow, hearing it from him, from someone who knew Mom, someone who'd loved her too, made it feel real. We stood there for a while longer, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I felt the night air cool on my skin, grounding me, reminding me that even with everything that had happened, I was still here, still breathing, still finding moments of peace, however small. Before he went back inside, Uncle Charlie gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Anytime you need a place to think," he said, nodding toward the trees, "this porch is yours." After he left, I stayed a little longer, letting the quiet settle into my bones. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of belonging, like I'd found a space where I could heal, a place that was becoming a little bit like home. Over the next few weeks, life with Uncle Charlie and Sarah started to fall into a steady rhythm. Mornings were filled with the familiar sounds of Sarah clanging around in the kitchen, her cheerful hums blending with the smell of coffee and toast. Uncle Charlie would be at the table, flipping through the newspaper, occasionally grumbling about something he read before sliding me the comics page with a wink. These small routines, simple as they were, gave my days a sense of order and comfort that I hadn't realized I needed. School was another story. Showing up every day, pretending like everything was normal, felt like slipping on an old jacket that didn't quite fit anymore. My classmates mostly kept their distance, some out of awkwardness, others because they didn't know what to say. I could see the pity in their glances, like I was a reminder of everything they didn't want to think about: loss, family falling apart, loneliness. And for the most part, I was okay with that. I didn't feel like explaining myself. Not yet. But one day after the final bell, I was clearing out my locker when I heard someone call my name. I turned to see Nate, an old friend from way back in elementary school. We'd drifted apart over the years, but seeing him now, with his easy smile and that same worn backpack he'd had since forever, felt strangely comforting. "Hey man," he said, shoving his hands into his pockets as he rocked back on his heels. You doing okay?" The question hung between us, simple yet heavy. I thought about brushing it off with a quick, "Yeah, fine," but something about Nate's face made me pause. Maybe I didn't need to pretend, at least not with him. I shrugged, leaning against the row of lockers. "Not really, but, I'm getting by." He nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine with a seriousness that surprised me. "I heard about what happened with your dad, and, well, Aunt Meg and everything." He glanced down, shuffling his feet awkwardly. "That's gotta be tough." Hearing someone else say it out loud felt strange, like a reminder that this whole thing was real and not just some bad dream. I forced a half smile. "Yeah, it's weird, honestly. Living with my uncle now, trying to get used to everything." Nate nodded again, and for a second, he didn't say anything, just stared down the hallway as if searching for the right words. "Well, I'm glad you've got family to look out for you," he said finally. "Uncle Charlie's a good guy." I nodded, feeling a bit of warmth at that. Uncle Charlie was more than a good guy. He was solid, dependable, the kind of person who didn't let you down, even when life got hard. And knowing that others saw that too, made me realize just how lucky I was to have landed with him and Sarah. Nate glanced at me, his expression shifting to something almost hopeful. "Listen, a few of us are going to the game Friday night. If you're up for it, we'd love for you to come. I mean, no pressure, just if you want to." For a second, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to pull back, to stay in the safe, familiar cocoon of Uncle Charlie's place, where I didn't have to explain myself to anyone. But there was another part of me, a quieter part, buried under everything, that missed the world outside of grief and loss. Missed friends, missed laughter, missed just being a kid. "Yeah," I found myself saying, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I think I like that." Nate's face broke into a grin, and he clapped me on the shoulder. "Great. We'll save you a seat." As I watched him walk away, I felt something shift inside me, like the faintest glimmer of hope breaking through the clouds. The Friday night football game came around faster than I expected. Uncle Charlie and Sarah seemed genuinely excited for me when I mentioned it, both of them nodding with encouragement. Sarah even offered to pack some snacks, insisting that stadium food costs an arm and a leg. I laughed, appreciating her motherly enthusiasm, but I told her I'd be fine. Still, there was something comforting about knowing they were as invested in my small steps forward as I was. The stadium was already buzzing with energy when I arrived. People were bundled up in sweaters and jackets, huddled in groups, their faces glowing under the lights. I scanned the stands, feeling a strange mix of excitement and nerves until I spotted Nate waving from the bleachers, a wide grin on his face. He patted the empty spot next to him, motioning for me to come over. "Glad you made it," he shouted over the crowd as I climbed up. "Thought you might bail on us." I shrugged, sliding into the seat next to him. "Honestly, I thought about it," I admitted, chuckling a little. "But I figured I'd be missing out." Nate laughed, shaking his head. "You would have. These games are the highlight of this town." He leaned in, lowering his voice as he added, not saying much, but still. I found myself laughing, letting my guard down for the first time in what felt like forever. There were a few other people from our old friend group there too. Some familiar faces, some who drifted off over the years. Each of them greeted me with a nod or a quick, "Hey man," but nothing too heavy, no uncomfortable sympathy or loaded questions. For once, I felt like just another kid in the crowd, not someone to tiptoe around. As the game kicked off, the air filled with cheers, shouts, and the sharp whistle of the referee. Nate filled me in on the season so far, sharing details about the players and a few funny mishaps that had happened at past games. We laughed over the plays, groaned at the fouls, and joined in the cheers without hesitation. It was normal, unremarkable, and exactly what I needed. At halftime, as we stretched our legs and waited for the teams to regroup, Nate turned to me, his face a little more serious. "It's really good to see you out here," he said. "I can't imagine what it's been like. Everything you've been through." I nodded, feeling a slight pang, but grateful he wasn't pressing too hard. "It's been rough," I admitted, keeping my voice low. "But living with Uncle Charlie and Sarah, it's helped." Nate nodded, looking out over the field, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know your uncle all that well, but I remember him coming to our practices back in middle school, helping out as a volunteer coach. He was the guy who always made us feel like we could do anything, no matter how bad we were." I smiled, picturing Uncle Charlie encouraging a group of middle schoolers, his booming laugh echoing over the field as he clapped them on the back. "Yeah, that sounds like him." There was a comfortable silence between us, filled with the hum of the crowd and the sounds of the game. And in that quiet, I felt something settle inside me, a kind of acceptance, maybe, or the beginning of one. I wasn't alone. I had people who saw me, who knew where I'd come from, and were willing to stick around. That realization filled a space inside me that I hadn't known was so empty. As the game wound down and we all filed out of the stadium, Nate clapped me on the back, grinning. "Same time next week?" I nodded, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "Yeah," I said, feeling lighter than I had in months. "I'd like that." When I got back to Uncle Charlie's that night, the house was quiet, and a warm light spilled out from the living room. I saw Uncle Charlie on the couch, a book resting on his lap and his reading glasses perched low on his nose. Sarah was curled up beside him, half asleep with a blanket pulled up to her chin. The scene stopped me in my tracks, a soft, ordinary moment, but one that made the house feel safe, like a place I could truly come back to. Uncle Charlie looked up as I stepped inside, his face breaking into a smile. "Hey, kiddo," he said, closing his book. "How was the game?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool, but a grin tugged at my lips. "It was good. I mean, I didn't expect to have that much fun, but yeah, it was a good time." Sarah opened her eyes, her smile gentle and sleepy. "I'm glad, sweetheart. It's nice to see you getting out there with friends." She stretched and pulled herself upright, her gaze warm and attentive. "Did you get a hot dog at least? It's not a football game without some overpriced food." I laughed. "I skipped the hot dog. Nate was going on about how terrible they were, so I thought I'd save my money." She chuckled, giving Uncle Charlie a nudge. "Smart kid. You're fitting in just fine here." Uncle Charlie shifted, looking at me with a quiet pride that made something in my chest loosen. "You're always welcome here. You know that, right?" His voice was soft but steady, each word carrying a weight that felt both comforting and grounding. "We're proud of you." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That simple, heartfelt reassurance was exactly what I needed, more than I'd realized. Uncle Charlie had shown me, bit by bit, that family didn't just mean the people you shared blood with. It could mean the people who chose to stand by you, who welcomed you when no one else would. After a minute, I managed a small smile. "Thanks, Uncle Charlie. And thanks for everything you and Sarah have done. It means a lot." He just nodded, patting the couch next to him. "Why don't you sit with us for a bit?" Sarah's been waiting to start this new mystery movie, and it's supposed to be a real thriller. I joined them, sinking into the softness of the couch, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. As the movie started and we passed around a bowl of popcorn, laughter filling the room, I realized that in this small, quiet house, I'd found something I thought I'd lost forever, home. No matter how complicated things with Dad might remain, or how uncertain the future felt, I knew I had this. I had a family that cared, people who saw me and didn't expect me to be anything but myself. And in that moment, I felt a new kind of strength rising within me, like I was finally ready to let go of the past and build something new.